Hey, what's up out there, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are going to continue our War of the Spark limited set review, this time with the red cards. If you want to see the other colors we've done up to this point, or a separate video on every single Planeswalker in the set, make sure you check out the channel, subscribe below for the rest of the set coming up after this, and as always, find us on Twitter at MTG_. If you want a bigger introduction than this, go ahead and check out the first couple videos in this series, but we're pretty far in now. You kind of have an idea of how I evaluate these cards and the tiers that I put them into, so let's get started right away. Starting off with our kind of low-end cards, this category goes to the sideboard and build-around cards and the otherwise completely unplayable cards. These cards are not necessarily bad. Well, some of them are bad, but for the most part, they're going to be cards that you don't want to include in your main deck unless you have something that makes them really good, or you bring them in during sideboard matches and they get a lot better, but you don't put them in your main deck and you probably don't draft them very highly. First one, Mythic Rare. Let's start off with a bang. Finale of Promise is X red in our finale cycle. This one's a Mythic Sorcery, and it's got a lot of text. It says you may cast up to one instant and one sorcery in your graveyard, each with converted mana cost X or less without paying their mana cost. And you exile those cards if you cast them. And then if X for Finale of Promise is 10 or more, you copy each of those spells twice instead, and you can choose new copies for the target. So for X, you get to cast 2 spells out of your graveyard. One has to be a sorcery, and one has to be an instant. You cannot target 2 instants or 2 sorceries with this card, even if X is 10 or greater. I don't think this card is unplayable. I'm not putting it in this category because I think it's bad. I'm putting it here because I do think it is a build-around card. You need to be a very specific concentration of instants and sorceries. You can't just be the quote-unquote spells matters, the blue-red deck. If you're playing like 10 instants and 2 sorceries, Finale of Promise loses a lot of its power. Note that it says up to 1 instant and up to 1 sorcery, so you could technically spew this off just to cast maybe a single instant or a single sorcery out of your graveyard, but if you're not getting full value off of this card, it loses basically the entire reason you want to play it. It does have some splashiness with the X is 10 or more, just like the rest of the finales, but I do think you can get rewarded in the type of deck that has a lot of cheap removal. If you're playing this in red-black or red-blue, and you have a lot of sorcery or instant speed draw and a lot of sorcery or instant speed removal, and you're playing just, your kind of Grixis-style control deck, and then this can be a nice little 2-for-1, and maybe just be an insane top deck at some point, but I think you can get your value off the card if you build around it. That being said, this doesn't just go in every single red deck. If you're playing a beatdown aggro deck and you have a bunch of pump spells and things of that nature as your instants and sorceries, this card seems less appealing. So if you take it, note that you need to kind of draft around it, and it should be pretty good when you cast it. A little bit more situational is Bolt Bend. This is 3 in a red for an uncommon instant. It costs 3 less to cast if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. So kind of this thing again. Red has a lot more 4-power creatures this time around. We saw this on a lot of black cards in the previous set, but there were only like 2 black creatures that had power 4 or greater, so it didn't really come up too often. But in red, there's enough in this set that lets it happen. The effect you get here is you change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. So the reward goes to whoever says the word target most often when they play this card. Anyway, just being able to redirect the target of a spell or ability is a fine thing to have, but it's so situational and you might be holding this card and it just won't do anything. There are some pretty cool things this card can do. Like if your opponent minuses a Planeswalker to interact with one of your cards, and then you redirect it and make it so that it either kills or bounces or immobilizes one of your opponent's cards instead, that could be a huge blowout. So there's a lot of potential here, but if you're casting this for 4 mana and you can't reliably do it for just a single red, this card I think is quite bad. You just have to hold up 4 mana to cast it. And if your opponent just doesn't do anything that targets your stuff, or maybe they don't even do something that's worth redirect and they just cast like, I don't know, a draw spell or something like that, then you kind of waste so much mana holding this up. So I do think this is more of a sideboard card for very interactive spells. If you're playing against a control heavy deck, then you can go ahead and bring this in. But if your opponent's not doing a lot of targeting and their targeted stuff doesn't really matter that much, I think you should leave this out, and I don't think this is a card you're going to want to main board. If you do feel like your deck wants this card, make sure you draft enough 4-power creatures that you can actually cast this for a single red. For 4 mana, I would basically never put this card in my deck, but the possibility is there, and it will be good when it works. But there are a lot of times that you just have to hold up mana and it won't do what you need it to. Blind Blast is next. It's 2 and a red for a common instant. Deals 1 damage to target creature. That creature can't block this turn. Draw a card. So a very expensive cantrip that only deals a single damage to a creature. I do not love this card. I think there are some 1 toughness creatures, but if you look through the previous videos, there's maybe like 1 or 2 in each color. It's not a prevalent thing. And this is just a little bit too expensive to be kind of a quote-unquote free spell, like something like Defiant Strike. You can at least cycle that for just a single white mana. This will get its mana every now and then. Blind Blast will take out a creature here and there, but for the most part, I'm leaving this as a sideboard option against aggressive decks with a lot of 1 toughness creatures. I'm really not looking to pick it up at all, but hey, if I have to sideboard it in, you could do worse than picking off a small creature and cantripping. Demolish is next. I never played Demolish. I never sideboarded in. I hate that they print cards like this in the set because it says the word artifact on it, and new players will just bring it in against artifacts. But honestly, there aren't even any artifacts in this set that are worth destroying, except maybe the vehicles, and creature removal works on those just fine. Don't bring this card in or start it or play it trying to destroy people's lands. It's just not an effective strategy. You use a whole turn to kill a land, and then your opponent just untaps and plays another land. It gets people sometimes, but even when it works, it's more of a fluke than it is a strategy. Don't play Demolish. Don't bring it in because your opponent has artifacts. Unless, like, literally your opponent's win condition is Parhelion 2, and you have no way to deal with that card, just find another way to deal with it. Demolish is not good. Even when you board it in, it's not good against the stuff it's supposed to interact with. Sarkhan's Catharsis is the last card in this category. It's not terrible, but it's not really a card you should be drafting super highly either. It's 4 and a red, common, instant, deals 5 damage to target player or planeswalker. So an instant speed, a lava axe that can also go to a planeswalker's face, but it's 5 mana, and it can't hit creatures, which is what you want your removal spells to do. So yeah, this can interact with planeswalkers. Every now and then it'll take out your opponent's PW, but keep in mind when your opponent resolves a planeswalker, they're going to get some sort of value off of it because they can minus or plus it the turn it comes in as soon as it hits the battlefield due to how priority works. So even if you Catharsis down a planeswalker, it's going to get some sort of value, maybe leave a creature behind, and then the Catharsis looks pretty bad there. Also, when you're just getting beat down by a bunch of creatures, this card looks terrible, just like Lava Axe. Lava Axe tends to be like a playable 23rd card in some hyper-aggressive red decks, so if that's a thing in this format, then Sarkhan's Catharsis is certainly a card you can put in as your top-end, game finish and burn spell. But for the most part, I would leave Dragon Arms in the sideboard, and I'm not really looking to pick it up compared to some of the other red removal we'll see later in this video. Alright, out of the unplayable category into the filler category. These are cards you're not super excited to have in your deck, but you'll play them and they'll make your deck most of the time. You just don't tend to pick early picks on them. First one is Dreadhorde Arcanist. It's 1 and a red for a 1/3. It is a rare zombie wizard with trample. I love my 1-power creatures with trample. And it says when it attacks, you may cast target instant or sorcery card with CMC less than or equal to Dreadhorde Arcanist's power from your graveyard without paying its mana cost, and then you exile it if you cast it. This is a constructed plan. It's actually pretty good in constructed, where you can attack and maybe cast shocks or pump spells out of your graveyard. Maybe you even get to pump this first and then cast bigger spells, but for limited, unless you have a ton of cheap spells and a ton of pump spells, this card is not going to be that good. It's a base 2 mana 1/3 with trample that's kind of a throwaway on a 1-power creature, and unless you have a very specific sort of deck that's going to guarantee you get a couple spells off of this, then I don't think the Arcanist is going to be that good. It really should be in the sideboard category, but at least a 2 mana 1/3 can block 2/2s in the format, so it's not completely dead card, and maybe it gets to do something if you have a bunch of pump spells, but I wouldn't take this card early and then try to draft a bunch of like kind of weak pump spells, but maybe there's some sort of like giant growth deck that can take advantage of it. So I'm gonna err on the side of doubt here and say that there is a deck it'll fit in, but unless you're drafting this for money, it's not a card you should be picking up early over some of the better uncommons. Devouring Hellion is 2 and a red for a 2/2 uncommon Hellion. Surprise, surprise. As it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice any number of creatures and or planeswalkers. If you do, it enters with twice that many +1/+1 counters on it. So if you sack a single thing, it comes down as a 4/4, and it gets bigger from there. This is more of a 3-drop that you want to cast much later in the game, rather than a 3-drop that you're excited to cast on turn 3. In fact, it's pretty bad on turn 3 because you're not likely to have a creature you want to sacrifice, and if you go too deep on it and sacrifice too many things and your opponent removes it, it's basically giving your opponent some 2-for-1s or 3-for-1s. This is an okay card to have to kind of devour, if you will, the planeswalkers that sit on the battlefield once they can't activate loyalty abilities anymore. So imagine you have something like a Tibalt, you go minus, make some devils. Tibalt's no longer really doing anything super relevant, so the Hellion can come down and eat it, but the Hellion still doesn't have trample, so even when you sack a creature and this thing comes down as a 4/4 or a 6/6, your opponent can just block it and not have to worry about it too much, and it's vulnerable to basically every type of removal. Note, for newer players, this is not an enter the battlefield trigger, so you can't deal 2 damage to it in response to the trigger. It's an as it enters trigger, so once it resolves, if your opponent's not countering it, you have the choice to go ahead and devour whatever you're going to devour, and it'll just automatically have the +1/+1 counters on it when it hits the battlefield. Should also note that red is not super big on proliferate here, so having +1/+1 counters isn't really a big deal on these cards unless you're in another color that really supports that. Next up, we have Goblin Assailant, 1 and a red for a vanilla 2/2 common Goblin Warrior. Feral Macha. If you know me personally in real life, you know that cards like Coral Commando and Feral Macha just kind of grind my gears. I like having vanillas in sets to kind of, temper the power and toughness of the entire set, but cards like this, when you include them in your deck, you just don't feel good about it. You don't feel like you got there, and there's really just not much to say about it. If 2/2s for 2 are that important to your deck, then this is the worst version of that card you can get, but for the most part, this isn't a card you want to draft. It just ends up in your deck if you really need the 2-drops. Nahiri Stoneblades, one of the, I guess, more power-pumping pump spells of this set. It's 1 and a red, common, instant, up to 2 target creatures each get +2/+0 until end of turn. Now, if this was just 2 mana target creature gets +2/+0, that would be borderline unplayable, but the fact that this can target 2 creatures means that it can deal a significant amount of damage. This by itself represents 4 damage, which can close out games pretty quickly and can surprise the opponent somewhat. Maybe they block 2 1/1s or 2 2/2s, and you can use this to trade those creatures up, maybe even get in some damage and trade up 1 creature, but I don't think this is a great combat trick. It doesn't pump toughness, and as I've said in some previous videos, I really like when my combat tricks make it easier for my creature to survive. It doesn't do very much on defense either, unless you're, again, trying to trade up, but I don't think this card's great. If you are that, hyper-aggressive mono-red deck, if that exists, then this will be a card you're a little bit happier with, but for the most part, I don't think I'm taking this card very highly. Goblin Assault Team, isn't that the name of a Yu-Gi-Oh card? The 2300 beater? I think it is. It's something like that. But anyway, Goblin Assault Team is 3 and a red for a common Goblin Warrior. It's a 4/1 with haste, and when it dies, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Again, 1/1 counters in red not as important as other colors due to the lack of proliferate hanging around in red, and 4/1 for 4 is horrendously bad. Yeah, it has haste, but that doesn't matter if your opponent can just block with anything and kill it. Maybe it gets that 4 damage in, but I'd rather have, maybe a 4/3 or a 4/4 for 4. Is that asking too much? And take away the haste, give me more toughness, and I'm happy. This card seems really bad to me. But again, if you're very aggressive and you have a use for that extra +1/+1 counter when this thing dies, then it gets a little bit better. But I think this card is terrible, maybe even the unplayable category. I'd be surprised if you basically never see this card cast. Or rather, I wouldn't be surprised if you never see this card cast throughout the majority of this format. Honor the God Pharaoh is 2 and a red. It's a common sorcery. As an additional cost you cast it, you have to discard a card, and then you draw 2 cards, plus you amass 1. This is essentially Tormenting Voice, but you get that amass on top of it. So you get a zombie token. If you already have an army on board, you get to go ahead and add a single counter to that. And I guess that's not terrible, but I really don't like this effect at 3 mana. Being able to use your whole third turn and just kind of filter cards rather than adding that much to the board doesn't seem that amazing to me. Amass is something, right? It's not nothing. If this was a 1/1 that had the ability attached to it, I'd like it a little bit better. But also note this isn't card advantage, just like Torment and Voice, cards of that nature. This doesn't net you any cards. You're simply down 2 cards and up 2 cards. But, you know, maybe you're holding this till later in the game. You get to hold a land and kind of turn it into something else. I think that's fine, but this isn't a card you're super excited about. It does get better in the blue-red spells deck. If you have things that trigger off cast and sorceries, you might be interested in having this, but it's not the best draw spell that you can get. It's certainly worse than the majority of blues draw spells, and I would rather have those before I draft Honor the God Pharaoh. Samut Spring is a single red mana. It is a common instant. Target creature gets +2/+1 until end of turn and gains haste plus scry 1. You know, that good old scry 1 you get to just throw on every instant of sorcery now. This card's okay. It's not super playable. It's probably even worse than Nahiri Stoneblades or Stone whatever it is. I don't think this card's great. Being able to give a creature haste and dealing a little bit of extra damage is just not that exciting, and using this in combat isn't that different than Nahiri Stoneblade, since the 1 toughness, again, doesn't usually make it super relevant in combat that you're going to survive. It doesn't save low toughness creatures, it doesn't help you trade up too well, and it doesn't even deal that much extra damage when you do get to cast this and get a creature in without it being blocked. So another combat trick I'm not super excited about, but if you're hyper aggressive red deck, a single Samut Sprint might do a little bit for you. Just don't imagine it's a card you want very highly. Grim Initiate is a single red mana for a 1/1 common zombie warrior. It has first strike, and when it dies, you amass 1. So this is kind of your doomed traveler, if you will, in red. First strike on a 1/1 is not spectacular. In fact, that doesn't do very much at all, unless your opponent's just jamming all their 1 toughness creatures into you. This doesn't even attack particularly well, since your opponent can just play a 2/2, which there are plenty of in this format, and then the Initiate just kind of sits there and looks around. You can't even really like chump attack this into a creature and hope to amass, because your opponent can kind of just take 1 damage. It's not that threatening. I think this card's fine. If you have sacrifice creatures, then this does provide 2 bodies for a single black mana. So if you're in need of expendable bodies, then Grim Initiate's fine there. Or if you're the all-in amass deck and you just need to make 1 super big zombie for some reason, or a zombie army, I should say, then I guess you draft this a little bit higher. But you're not looking to pick this card up super early, and if it falls into your deck, you can certainly play it. It's just not going to be that impactful early on, or really later in the game either. Bond of Passion is the red bond here. Gruul and Boros coming together for a very mediocre effect. This one, 4 red, uncommon, sorcery. Gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap it, it gains haste, all that usual Act of Treason stuff, and then Bond of Passion deals 2 damage to any other target. That is not a lot of damage for your 6 mana spell. I'm not really in the market for casting Act of Treason in the first place, the 3 mana take a creature for the turn, and adding a shock onto that doesn't seem that great. You can't even do anything with the creature you took control of. There aren't any free sacrifice outlets floating around this set, so it's not like you can pay 6 mana, take a creature, and then sacrifice it to some sort of effect. That's not going to come up. And 2 damage on your 6 mana spell just isn't going to deal with a lot of the stuff you want to. My guess here is that the idea is you want to take their big creature and then shock their little creature and maybe get in a bunch of damage that turn, but I don't think it's going to play out like that very well. Not for a 6-mana sorcery. This is just a little bit too telegraphed. Maybe I should eat my words on this one a month into the format after I die to it, but I don't think it's good. I just don't think 6 mana for an Act of Treason with a kind of little piddly shock attached to it is where you want to be in this format. Play it as the top end, but probably don't play more than one of them, and honestly, if you're me, don't play it at all. Alright, so we can stop talking about cards I'm not excited about and start getting into our average middle-of-the-pack picks. These are the ones that usually don't wheel, and you're not super disappointed to play them, but you're also not picking them up super highly in the pack. First one is Sideboard Rager, 1 and a red for a 1/2 uncommon devil. When it dies, deals 1 damage to any target, and for a 1 and a red, you can pump it +2/+0 until end of turn. I like this card mostly as a way to threaten your opponent's planeswalkers. Either they attack into them and you can threaten to pump and kill the planeswalkers, or they block and you can make sure you get that damage in. Plus, Sideboard Rager should be pretty good at trading up. It's decent mana sink as well. It's basically fire breathing that you can only do in chunks of 2 since it gets 2 power. It doesn't really have evasion, but it's going to deal 1 damage no matter what, and it can play offense and defense fine. Not a card you want to fill your deck with since it doesn't pump its own toughness and is a little bit mana intensive to be good, but when your 2-drop can trade up for your opponent's 4 or 6 drops and threaten to kill their planeswalkers, I think that's the sign of a card that you're interested in playing in your red deck. Heartfire is 1 and a red for a common instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, deals 4 damage to any target. So that's a lot of damage at instant speed for just 2 mana. This is going to kill almost anything you target, but sacrificing a creature or a planeswalker is a real cost to be able to cast this in the first place. This isn't the type of thing that on a stalled out board or a board that, maybe you don't have any creatures, your opponent is beating you down, you just need to top deck something. This is not the type of card that's going to get you out of that situation. It is going to be good if you have expendable cards like Grim Initiate and stuff like that that dies into additional triggers, maybe even something like Sideboard Rager, but for the most part, you probably play 1 or 2 Heartfires, but you don't go super hard on picking it up, especially since it's not that much better than some of the better removal we'll see on the next slide. Chain Whip Cyclops is 4 and a red for a 4/4 common Cyclops Warrior. Pretty simple ability, 3 and a red, activate it, target creature can't block this turn. We see effects like this now and then, and they usually underperform just because your opponent generally has a bunch of creatures on board, and if this makes it so that one creature can't block, maybe some combination of other creatures can take it down. It's also super expensive to activate this ability, so if you activate that, that's usually like the only thing you're doing that turn. 4 mana is a lot just to make it so a creature can't block. Note that this just says target creature can't block, not that it can't block Chain Whip Cyclops, so the Cyclops might be an avenue for you to just alpha strike your opponent down. I think it's fine. I don't think you really want this card super highly, but if you're looking to attack, and your red decks are usually looking to attack, I think the Cyclops is fine and another decent mana sink for red. Chandra's Pyrohelix, another reprint here in the similar vein to Sorin's Thirst, which we mentioned in the black video. This is 1 and a red for a common instant. It deals 2 damage divided as you choose among any 1 or 2 target creatures. Side note, this is in standard with Pestilence Spirit, which is kind of cool, but that's not relevant to this set. For this set, I think this is fine. 2 mana for 2 damage is fine, and sometimes this can pick off a 1 toughness creature while also pinging a player or planeswalker, and sometimes this alone will be enough to shoot a planeswalker down if it's got, if it's activated and it's at a low loyalty count. The dream, of course, is being able to pick off 2 toughness creatures or 2 1 toughness creatures, which just doesn't come up that often, but when it does, it feels great. Pyrohelix, fine card, not one you want a billion copies of, but you'll usually pay 1 or 2, and it's going to be good against other opposing aggro decks and pretty bad against controlling decks. On Crop Invader is 2 and a red for a 2/2 common zombie Minotaur Warrior. As long as it's your turn, it has first strike, and you may pay 1 mana and sack another creature to give it +2/+0 until end of turn. This is a great card in teaching people threat of activation, where as long as you have a creature that you would normally be willing to sacrifice on board, you can just kind of jam this into your opponent, and then your opponent has to weigh the benefits and losses of you being able to pump it. Sometimes they kind of force your hand and then you have to pump the creature, but a lot of times your opponent will see that they'll just lose something on the block to On-Crop Invader, and you just get in there for 2 damage. You never even have to activate it. Invader gets a lot better if you have cards like Grim Initiate, again, that are worth sacrificing, but the more, evened out your creatures are, the more expensive your deck is, and the more expensive your creatures are, the less you're going to want to activate this ability. 3 mana, 2/2 first striker. Some amount of the time I don't think is quite enough for me to draft this card highly, but the activated ability kind of pushes it into the middle tier for me. If you're not willing to sacrifice creatures, this card takes a huge hit, and if you have expendable creatures, this card gets a lot better. Raging Crunch is 2 and a red for a 4/3. It's a common beast, and it can't attack alone. These cards tend to perform fine in decks with a bunch of creatures, and they tend to be huge liabilities against other cards. I'm thinking of something like Wojek Bodyguard from Guilds of Ravnica, which couldn't attack or block alone, but when it was going, it was very good, right? It was actually one of Red's best commons in that set. But if you're a controlling deck with a bunch of removal spells, you can actually maneuver yourself in a position to take advantage of the downside here. If you find yourself playing against a deck that just has tons and tons of removal, then the crunch gets a lot worse because they don't even have to kill the crunch, they just kill your other creatures, and the crunch can't ever do anything. Thankfully, this one's still able to block by itself, it just can't attack by itself. So it gets to do something and it's not completely dead on a board of creatures, but I think this is a card that you'll take in your aggressive red decks, although you should be boarding it out against removal-heavy decks. Invading Manticore, kind of another set of just stats on an expensive creature. It's 5 and a red for a 4/5 common zombie Manticore, Sweetheart. When it enters the battlefield, amass 2. So altogether, you're getting 6 power, 7 toughness for 6 mana. This seems like a fair deal to me. Not anything special. None of it has evasion unless something strange is going on with that army. But I think this is fine. You probably want at most one of these, and you don't want too many other 5 or 6 drops in your deck if you're running this. But I think a red deck can do a lot worse than having something like this at the top end of their curve. Burning Prophet, 1 and a red for a common human wizard. This is a 1/3, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and then, boom, you scry 1. Yeah, this is a fine payoff for having a bunch of spells in your deck. It can deal some damage, but I wouldn't expect this to just go off. I would rather have the couple creatures in the set that get +1/+1 counters whenever you cast instants or sorceries or other non-creature spells, but this is fine. It also plays defense fairly well, where if you have a bunch of mana open, your opponent has to be a little bit hesitant about how much they're willing to attack into you. If you have a bunch of non-creature spells, you might be able to pump this and trade it up. And Scry 1's not something to laugh at. I know I'm kind of poking fun that they just stick Scry 1 on a bunch of these cards, but it's not a bad thing to have. It is nice when every spell you cast lets you scry as well and just make sure you're hitting more spells. So I think this card's fine, but too many of them can be a liability since without spells, it's a little bit under par. Spellgorger Weird, Speak of the Devil, is 2 and a red for a common 2/2 Weird. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Spellgorger Weird. So there's a blue card, Thunder Drake, I believe it was, that does something very similar to this, but that one has evasion, and I guess that one only triggers when you cast your second spell, so it doesn't have to be non-creature spells specifically, but I like that a lot more than Spellgorger Weird. I think the Weird is fine. If you get a single counter on it, it's a 3 mana 3/3, and that's decent. So if you play this on turn 3, and then on turn 4 you cast maybe 1 or 2 spells, it seems okay, but it doesn't have evasion, doesn't have trample, doesn't have flying. It's just a pile of stats, but it's a nice way to turn your spell-based deck into extra power. And while you don't want a bunch of these, since your spell decks are usually pretty light on creatures, 1 or 2 of them can go a long way. Turret Ogre is next up, 3 and a red. This one is a common Ogre Warrior for 4. 3, 2, 1. Turret Ogre is up next. This one is 3 in a red for a 4/3 common Ogre Warrior. This one has reach, and when it enters the battlefield, if you control another creature with power 4 or greater, Turret Ogre deals 2 damage to each opponent. Can't hit creatures, but the stat line is fine on this. 4/3 reach for 4 is an okay card. Even without reach, I would consider playing this a pretty large amount of the time, and reach does give red kind of, pun intended, a little bit of reach against the blue and black and white flyers in the set. So I think Turret Ogre is fine. This one I'm not going out of my way for to get another 4-power creature, but if it just incidentally deals 2 to my opponent, I'm pretty happy with that. It's just not something I'm willing to stretch my mana base for and go out of my way to draft. If it happens, it happens. If not, not too much loss there. Next category is our above average cards. These are the cards you're picking up early in the pack, usually within the first 4 to 5 picks. You should not expect them to wheel, but you also should not be taking them over some of the bomb rares in the set. Chandra's Triumph is our first one of the removal spells I was talking about. 1 in a red for an instant. It's uncommon, and it deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. That's already pretty nice coverage. If you happen to have a Chandra Planeswalker, it deals 5 damage to that permanent instead. And if you have a Chandra Planeswalker, congratulations, you've got a bunch of combos in your deck, and that card is sweet. Chandra's Triumph is fine as just 2 mana to deal 3 damage to a creature. That's a card I'm drafting basically every single time, and I'm picking it up early. If you see it late, it's a good sign that red is up, and being able to hit a Planeswalker is nice as well. I'm not really putting any weight on the Chandra Planeswalker part of this card, but by itself, just being able to deal 3 damage is fine. Last thing I want to say about this, it's a little bit of a side note, but if you've ever played the game Twisted Metal Black, Chandra's Triumph's art looks exactly like the other half of Sweet Tooth's face on that. Look it up. Twisted Metal Black game cover, and then put it side by side with Chandra's Triumph. It's great. Alright, back on topic, we have Cyclops Electromancer, 4 in a red for a uncommon Cyclops Wizard. It's a 4/2, very under par. I don't even like 4/2s for 3 mana, really, so a 4/2 for 5 has to have a great ability. I do, however, think this one pays you off quite a bit. When it enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to target creature an opponent controls. X is the number of instants or sorceries in your graveyard. Now, I was thinking of putting this in the medium category, but I remember a card from Amonkhet. I think it's Warfire Javelineer. It's the same exact card for 1 less mana and had the same exact ability, and that card was fantastic. And there was a Spells Matters theme in that set as well in blue-red. So if this card's anything like that, even though it costs 1 more mana, this should be kind of the highlight of your blue-red deck. If you can get 1 or 2 of these in your blue-red deck, it should perform very well, and you should be able to have enough spells in your graveyard that this can snipe down a 3 or 4 toughness creature when you play it. It plays very well with cantrips, or basically just draw spells in general, and it should be your good kind of top-end 2-for-1 that you're really looking for. It pays you off for being in blue-red more than a lot of the other cards do, and while I think those cards are fine, I think the Electromancer is one that you're really hoping to get multiples of. Jaya's Greeting, Grandma Jaya, is 1 in a red for a common instant. It deals 3 damage to target creature, and hey, check that out, Scry 1. Why does it do that? Who knows? But 3 damage, I can say anything about this that I said about Chandra's Triumph, with the exception of being able to target a Planeswalker. The difference, of course, is that this one's a common, and you are basically always drafting 2 mana, deal 3 damage to a creature at common. You'll play as many copies of this card as you can get, and if for some reason it ends up being bad against 4 toughness or 5 toughness creatures, you can trim the number of Jaya's Greetings you have, but you will take and start as many Jaya's Greetings as you can get. Note, this one does not hit players, nor does Chandra's Triumph, so there's a lot less going to the face, or a lot less versatility in the burn spells being able to just burn your opponent out of the game, but you should be able to play You should be able to play creature control quite well with the red burn spells in this set. Dread Horde Twins, the True Heart Duelist, I think that card was named, or True Heart Twins from Amonkhet. Well, apparently they're zombies now. It's 3 in a red for a 2/2 uncommon zombie jackal warrior, and when it enters the battlefield, you amass 2, and then this is also one of those zombie token lords. We saw a blue one and a black one that gave flying and death touch respectively. This one gives your zombie tokens trample. So again, zombie tokens basically applies to Amass tokens, or your army tokens, with the exception of 1 or 2 mythic rares that make other kinds of zombies. But giving your army trample is nice. A lot of times I think these armies can get really big, but they don't have evasion themselves unless you grant them evasion. And I think the twins given trample is a little bit worse than giving your army flying with the blue one, but a little bit better than giving it death touch with the black one. I like the twins. You get 4 power for 4 mana, 4 toughness for 4 mana, and even though I would rather this just make 2/2/2 bodies, this is sometimes going to just make a army bigger rather than giving you another creature, and I think that's fine. Note that this card gets a lot worse against removal heavy decks since they're just going to kill the army and all you get left over is a 2/2. But I think that's fine. You do get your stats worth out of the mana cost here, even if you can't always have control over how you allot the counters to your army. Mizzium Tank is our, I believe, final vehicle. We already went over the white and blue one. Yeah, this is the third and final vehicle in the set. It's 1 red for a rare vehicle. It has trample, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it becomes an artifact creature and gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So that kind of circumvents you having to crew it. You can crew it with a crew 1 cost, though, which means basically any creature that has any amount of power can go ahead and crew the tank. It's not great, though, right? 3 mana 3/2 trample isn't exactly amazing for crew 1. The cheapest crew cost you can basically get. And you get kind of a Naga Eternal with trample, which isn't really breaking the bank. But this can have some surprise factor too. It does get pumped for every spell you cast that turn, and when it does attack, it's attacking usually as a 4/3 trampler, sometimes bigger than that. It plays quite well with pump spells like Samut Sprint and Nahiri Stoneblades. Although it can't target the Mizzium Tank unless it's already a creature that turn, so that's a little bit awkward. But I think this card is a fine card to pick up early. Again, not a bomb. Don't pick this up over like a really solid removal spell. But if you find yourself in that blue-red spells deck we keep mentioning, I think you'll play Mizzium Tank and you'll be happy it's in there. All right, and our bombs, our first picks, the cards we're super excited about. Give you one guess what card's going to pop up here. It's a god. Anyway, we have 3 cards to talk about in this category, starting with our second, I guess, third iteration of Neheb. In this case, Neheb is the Dreadhorde Champion, 2 red. It is a 5/4 rare legendary zombie minotaur warrior. Look at the text on that text box. It's tiny. He has trample, already sold. 4 mana, 5/4 trample. Remember that hippo? It was like a 5/4 for 5 in black with no abilities, and I said that was like a middle category type card. Dreadhorde Champion has trample and costs 1 less mana, so yeah, it's already getting a high pick just for that. 5/4 trampler for 4 mana, can't do much better than that on the vanilla test, but there's more. Whenever Neheb deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you may discard any number of cards, and if you do, you draw that many cards and add that much red mana. The red mana does not disappear in between phases until the end of the turn. So if you use this ability in combat, which is when it's going to trigger, you get to keep whatever red mana you're producing in combat for your second main phase, maybe even your end step or whatever. But yeah, this card's great. Being able to turn a bunch of dead cards in your hand, especially since it says trample, it's almost always going to deal combat damage unless your opponent kills it right away. Even if it trades off, you're probably dealing damage, and then you get to just loot away all of the cards you don't like. Basically, it's a rummage. You don't draw first, but if you have excess lands in your hand or you have spells that have dropped off, maybe you even have like your little goblin assailants, your 2/2s that you don't really want to cast later in the game, pitch them away, draw a bunch of extra cards, and then Neheb even rewards you by giving you some red mana to cast your new hand and your new set of cards. Even if you don't loot anything away, that means your hand's probably pretty good, and you've got a 5/4 trampler for 4. So I don't know how many times I can repeat that. That's just a fantastic stat line with evasion. Your first pick in Neheb every time you see it. It's better than I think every uncommon and most of the premium removal in the set. So I'm taking Neheb, and I'll be happy to play it, and you should be too. Krenko is up next. This is actually a finicky bomb, right? I do think you first pick this card, but it needs a little bit of work to be an actual bomb. But yeah, you're going to lose to this card at least once or twice, and it's not going to feel good. Krenko Tin Street Kingpin is 2 in a red for a rare legendary goblin. It's a 1/2. 3-mana 1/2 is pretty bad. But when it attacks, put a 1/1 counter on it, then create a number of 1/1 red goblin creature tokens equal to Krenko's power. Wow, this has the potential to just completely wreck a game on its own. Think Legion Warboss, but pumped up on steroids. And that's what Krenko Tin Street Kingpin is. So break it down. When this thing attacks for the first time, it's a 2/3, and you create 2 1/1 goblin creature tokens. So even if Krenko trades off, you get a whole, dragon fodder worth of goblins for essentially free. There's a couple other cool things you can do with this. First off, if you're in a color that can proliferate, maybe at instant speed, then you get to attack with Krenko, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then you can proliferate in response to the trigger and make more goblins. In addition to that, if you have pump spells like Nahiri Stoneblades, this is the type of card that wants it. You give it +2/+0 when it attacks, and you just make 2 more goblin tokens. If your opponent doesn't kill Krenko on the first attack, that means they're probably not going to kill it at all, and then Krenko gets to just steal the game away. It gets bigger every time it attacks, it makes more goblins every time it attacks, and it snowballs out of control. If you can slam this on turn 3 and then keep it clear, make sure it's getting in there, maybe give it some sort of evasion with, like, I don't know, some janky aura. Imagine that mission, what was it, Stealth Mission? The blue card that puts 2 counters on a creature and makes it unblockable. That's the dream scenario with Krenko. So yeah, I think you first pick Krenko. You're very happy to play it. You want to play aggressive and you want to get your opponent's blockers out of the way. But on its own, it needs some support, especially since it's a 1/2 for 3. This card does not block well, and it's not going to be great when you're behind. But when you're ahead, this card can win the game on its own. And yeah, we have the God. The gods are all mythic. You're going to lose to them every time they're played. They're going to be annoying. You're going to hate them. But we still have to talk about them. Ilharg, the Raise Boar, is 3 red. This one's a mythic legendary boar god, because why not? And it's a 6/6 trample. Oh my god. So remember how we said Neheb, 4 mana 5/4 trample? Well, 5 mana 6/6 trample is absurdly good. When it attacks, okay, check this out. When it attacks, you may put any creature from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. The creature bounces back to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. So if a 5 mana 6/6 trampler wasn't bad enough, you also get a free attacker out of your hand. It can be anything. Any big creature you have in your hand floating around. Doesn't have to be that great. And you get enter the battlefield triggers. If you have something that maybe enters the battlefield when it, or amasses when it enters the battlefield, like that Eternal Manticore that we saw, you're just going to amass every time Ilharg attacks, and then you get to bounce that creature back to your hand, maybe play it second main phase. In fact, that's worth mentioning that if you have Ilharg and you have a creature that's worth casting, you probably attack with Ilharg first, get the free attack out of that creature, and then play that creature during the second main phase. And I just realized that doesn't work because the creature bounces back to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. So ignore that all completely. Don't forget about the God Clause. If Ilharg dies or it goes to exile from the battlefield, you can just stick it in your library 3rd from the top and you'll draw it again in 3 turns. So your stats are great here. I don't even think this is as good as like Oketra or what's the blue one, Kefnet, but I do think it's on par with the rest, and you know, on par is not saying that much when all of them are just absolute bomb rares. There's not a single card in the set that I'm taking over my Ilharg. No common or uncommon comes close to it, and it's hard to deal with too. So I'm sorry that you're going to lose to these gods. I'm sorry they put them in the set, and I'm sorry they come back in 3 turns if you do deal with them, but we have to deal with them for the next 3 to 4 months. So if you open one, you should be happy to play it, and you should be happy winning games where you didn't really have to try that hard because your gods are busted. So going out, I love that we get to wrap up every video by talking about some busted god. And yeah, we'll talk about another one in the green video, which will be up next. And then after the green video, we're going to cover all of the multicolored cards plus all of the lands. And that's about 40 cards altogether. So I think that video is going to go on just a little bit long. I know these tend to be 40, 50 minutes or so. But I like talking about the cards. What can I do? So if you're still here, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe below and find us on Twitter at MTG_Manarocks. If I messed up on any card, maybe I misread it like Ilharg or something like that, please comment below and let me know so I can fix that, or at least so I personally know not to, run into some sort of trap because I misread a card or something like that. It happens sometimes. But anyway, thanks for watching. Stay tuned. We've got 2 more parts coming up for War of the Spark. And yeah, thanks for being here. See you next time.